The nickel is for the colonial ships. Closest any of them or any of us is gonna get to that grand life off-world. So come on now. What sort do you have in mind? Because I got all kinds.
Welcome to Kermode Uncut, where we return to the subject of Blade Runner 2049. Now, if you saw the review that I did on the 5 Live film review show I do with Simon Mayo, you'll know that I loved Blade Runner 2049. I thought it was a really valid sequel to the original. In fact, I was just one of many reviewers who praised the film to the skies. And before it opened, everybody had very, very great expectations for it. Since it's opened, however, there have been loads of stories about it being a flop, it being a failure, it being a film that hasn't connected with audiences. And this is largely to do with box office figures. Before Blade Runner 2049 opened, some people were predicting that in its first 3 days in America, it would do close to $50 million. In fact, in its first 5 days, it did closer to $40 million. Now, that would be great if your film cost $85 million, but for a film which costs upward of $150, which is what Blade Runner 2049 is reported as costing, that constitutes a soft opening. Outside of America, it was a slightly different case. Here in the UK, Blade Runner did terrifically well. In its first weekend, it took something like 6 million, took more than Mad Max Fury Road, almost as much as La La Land. So here, it was a huge hit. But this has raised questions about, firstly, how do you define a hit? And secondly, is Blade Runner connecting with its audience? I think it raises a number of important issues. The first one is this. Despite what everyone says, critics clearly do not define box office. I mean, as far as the reviews went, Blade Runner 2049 was a rock-solid hit. It got 5 stars from almost all the major publications. Critics were fawning all over it. And yet, it has been defined as not doing that well at the box office. And think of a film like Mother, Darren Aronofsky's movie, which was clearly a film which critics loved, but some audiences were completely befuddled by. So no matter what anyone says, critics are not in charge of box office. Secondly, some people have suggested that one of the problems with Blade Runner 2049 is its gender politics, that there's something about the way in which it depicts its female characters that is not progressive, that is retrogressive, that is backward-looking. Now, I have to say, I don't actually agree with that argument. I think you can read the female characters in Blade Runner 2049 in a number of different ways, and I think the film is actually very subversive. The idea that its gender politics are not forward-looking has accounted for its failure is an interesting one, because it means that gender politics are moving to the forefront. When people are starting to say that a film has failed at the box office because it has negative gender politics, that means we have moved on. Even if I don't agree with it in relation to Blade Runner 2049, the fact that people are having that argument is some cause for rejoicing.
You're a cop.
Thirdly, some people have suggested that the problem with Blade Runner 2049 was it was simply too confusing for a mainstream audience, that they couldn't follow the plot, they couldn't keep up with it. Now, this just isn't the case. I mean, Blade Runner 2049 is a very complex film, but audiences can keep up with very complex films. I mean, look, for example, at Christopher Nolan's Inception. There was a story which the studio itself were worried was going to leave a lot of the audience behind, and they didn't. People can follow those stories if they want to. The case is, with Blade Runner 2049, perhaps they didn't want to.
We were being hunted. By who?
So why did Blade Runner 2049 underperform in the US? Well, I think the answers are boringly simple. Firstly, it had an R rating, which is always restrictive. Secondly, it turns out that apparently people under the age of 25 aren't that interested in Blade Runner. And thirdly, the film has a long running time, 163 minutes, and that's a large chunk of time. The other thing that's worth remembering is that Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, the original, flopped when it first opened. We now think of it as a classic. We now think of it as one of the milestones of sci-fi cinema. When it first came out, it was a failure, both critically and at the box office. How much we want to judge a film's success by how much money it takes is something which is always going to be a thorny issue. For me, I look at films like William Friedkin's Sorcerer, which absolutely tanked when it opened in 1977 and is coming back to UK cinemas November the 3rd, and now everybody thinks it's William Friedkin's best film. Blade Runner 2049 is a complex beast. Some people love it, some people hate it. I think in the end, judging it on its box office isn't fair to the film. I think it will have long-lasting status, and I think it will eventually be accepted as a classic. But you know what? I don't actually care how much money it takes. I'm just kind of glad it exists.
Your story isn't over yet. There's still a page left.